space because we've kind of all been through similar training and virtual stuff before. So if I do have anything absolutely meltdown, I know you'll have sympathy with me. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a bio of me anyway. But I thought I'd quickly explain how I got into doing this trauma informed work. So in the sector, trauma informed practice became a bit of a buzzword a few years ago, and I was seeing the charities I worked in, stuff on LinkedIn, everyone talking about being trauma informed for our service users, but that didn't seem to kind of trickle down to our volunteers and our staff and the way we interact and support them. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do. So I was doing my personal development plan with my line manager. And I thought, right, I'm going to look at trauma informed practice in volunteering. And then I looked out there, and there weren't any resources about how to be a trauma informed volunteer manager. There wasn't massive bants about how to be a trauma informed manager generally. So I was like, okay, well, I'll kind of try and figure it out as I go. And then I started blogging about it on LinkedIn and got a really good response. So I thought, okay, let's try and share the learning wider. And that's how inclusive volunteering came around. It's lovely to see where everyone's all over the place. I should say I am in a place called Berkhamsted, which is, whenever I say that, everyone's like, no idea where it is. So I always say, kind of, people have heard of Hemel Hempstead or St Albans, there-ish. But obviously, it's not, you don't need three guesses to guess where I'm from because this is the thickest East London accent that ever was. So I will try and slow down, but us Cockneys are not known for our slow speech patterns. Cool. Then I will jump into sharing. Thank you for, please continue to introduce yourself and say hello in the chat. Also, I'm not precious about being asked questions as we go. So if you do have questions, pop them in the chat and I'll see if I can grab them as we go. And we'll obviously have space at the end too. Can I get a thumbs up, Mishka? Can you see that?
Not yet. Oh, yeah, we got it. Very nice.
Smashing.
All yours now.
Smashing. Cool. So yeah, we're talking about why trauma-informed practice is important in volunteer management, and also kind of talking a little introductory session on how we can embed some of those practices into our volunteer management. So what is trauma-informed practice? Essentially, trauma-informed practice is just recognizing that everyone comes from different experiences. Though when you meet someone for the first time, whether it's a volunteer, a colleague, a service user, there's no way to know everything about them. Even through what they share in their interview, you won't know every aspect of their life and their experiences. So it's just about understanding that there's things about that we don't know about people. So we're putting in safeguards to ensure that we're supporting them in the best possible way. It's viewing trauma-related behaviours as a coping mechanism. I will say, like, since I started getting knowledgeable about trauma-informed practice, it's really changed the way that I even approach my relationships with my friends and my family. Just understanding that actually, if someone acts in a certain way, they're not trying to be hurtful, they're not trying to be disruptive, they're just communicating their emotions in a way that I don't necessarily communicate them in. So we're just approaching things in different ways. So if you work with young people, you will have heard the phrase action is communication or behavior is communication. But we don't necessarily grow out of that. Our behaviors might change and our reactions might change. But a lot of the way people, if they become distant, if they become anxious, they might raise their voice, they might act in a way that, yeah, wouldn't necessarily be your reaction. But sometimes that can be because it's a trauma response. So then we want to integrate knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices. So if we have them in our policies and the way we onboard volunteers, the way we interact with volunteers, then it just makes sure those safeguards are there the whole way through. So we're not just using it as a tick box of like, oh, yes, we are trauma informed, embedding it in everything that we do to make sure that it flows through and we're not just giving ourselves one of those charity sector buzzwords that come around every now and again. And taking a strengths-based approach. So looking at people's successes, trying to look at the positives in a situation. If someone has things that they really struggle with, then we wouldn't necessarily place them in that space. But if there's something they're really good at, really confident in, that's when we might place them in their volunteer role or whatever we're doing. And avoiding re-traumatization. So this is just making sure that we aren't putting people in situations where we think they could lead to re-traumatization based on their previous traumas, or even interact with trauma in a new way because it's a new upsetting situation. And that can be difficult in the charity sector because quite often we are dealing with quite complex issues. But we want to do as much as we can to avoid re-traumatization, and when it does happen, offer support. And pursuing continuous learning, any kind of trauma-informed practice, inclusion, accessibility, there's always new resources coming up. So making sure you're following the right people on social media, you're signing up to the newsletters that come out so that you are keeping on top of the new ways and better ways that we can be supporting our volunteers. So why is it important for us in volunteer management, not just in the charity sector? Well, in the UK, it's predicted that 70% of all adults have had one traumatic experience in their life. So that might be bereavement, it could be an accident, incident, it could be that they've experienced abuse, it could be that they've experienced homelessness. There's lots of things that people could have experienced, and 70% of the population have experienced trauma. That means it's going to be likely the same percentage of people that come through your applications that have experienced trauma. I also say that we know, and I'm sure you've seen it in your applications, that you get a lot of applications for people with lived experience. When I was on the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, we had so many survivors who had been through services and then wanted to give back. But then to go into a role where they were going to be supporting other survivors could be really, really traumatic. So we had to put stuff in place for them. And there will be, in every charity in this room, there will be volunteers that come to you that have lived experience of the issue that you're supporting. So we want to make sure that we're making them safe and secure when they're volunteering. There's also increase of risk of vicarious trauma. So again, if they're taking disclosures, if they're listening to service user stories, if they're out on the street, sometimes they might interact with instances that might be traumatic, or through hearing about stories. So vicarious trauma is sometimes known as kind of secondary trauma or third party trauma. It's where you're hearing stories and taking that anxiety and sadness at home with you. So it can be, and it can lead to poor mental health and well-being. If we don't have things in place to support volunteers who are hearing difficult things, then it can also lead to compassion fatigue, where it just becomes a churn of, oh, well, I've heard something awful now, and they begin to lose the empathy to be able to support people just because it becomes a trivial thing because they've had to experience so much of it. There's also the possibility of transference. So if you do have a volunteer with lived experience, they might transfer their own experience onto the service user. So if they have experience of childhood familial abuse, they might be supporting a family and then put their anger and their anxiety about their experience onto the caregivers in that situation. So we want to be careful that we're not putting them in situations where transference might happen, and also putting in like risk assessments and stuff if you do have a volunteer with similar lived experience. Also reduces burnout. So making sure that, if we've got all of our trauma-informed stuff, we're supporting people, we're giving them support before, during, after in their volunteer journey, then we're going to reduce that burnout. And also it can help you place the right volunteers in the right role and make sure they've got the same level of support. For example, again, going back to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, I had an amazing volunteer who was a survivor. And I knew when I did my check-ins with her, I'd always put away a longer period of time, because I knew that she'd want to talk about her personal experience as well as how it was impacting her on the helpline. So just knowing you've got the right level of support for the right volunteer. And then, of course, how it helps us organisationally. So it improves retention and satisfaction of volunteers. We know as staff, if we're not happy, if we're not supported, then we're more likely to leave. And that's even doubly so for volunteers, because they haven't even got the fact that we're helping them pay their bills to stay. So if we're not supporting our volunteers in the right way, they'll leave. So trauma-informed practice does lead to improved retention. Improved understanding and knowledge of our volunteers, so they make better support so they may better support our service users. So people manage the way they were managed. So if we're approaching our volunteers in a supportive way, then that's the way they're going to interact and support their service users. Also, if you've gone through trauma-informed training, you can introduce trauma-informed training as part of your induction process as well. We've put into ours, and I think it's really, really helpful. Better program outcomes. I always say this is something I say all the time in volunteering. If you look after the penny, the pounds look after themselves. If you look after your volunteers and you have great volunteer support, then they're going to be amazing support for your service users. So you look after the volunteers and the service users are looked after. And of course, increased inclusivity and accessibility. So trauma-informed practice will help you welcome people with lived experience, but it could also be lived experience of oppression, lived experience of being excluded from spaces. So it does include good trauma-informed practice includes all forms of EDIA. Builds trust and strong community bonds, and also improves organisational reputation. So if you're offering a good volunteer opportunity, then that's the best. We all know the best form of volunteering recruitment tends to be word of mouth and people hearing about other people's good experiences, bringing their mates along, sharing it with their friends. So that's kind of like the introduction bit. And now I'm going to jump into some of the things that might be useful to apply to your volunteer programs. If my thing moves, there we go. So principles of trauma-informed practice. So these are the core principles of trauma-informed practice, and it will flow through everything that you do. If you've got these things down, then basically you're laughing. So firstly, safety, trust and transparency, choice, collaboration, empowerment of voice, and cultural consideration. Oh, she's gone too far. So first off, safety. So creating an environment where people feel safe and are able to ask for support in order to help them feel safe. So we're not just responsible for our volunteers' physical safety, we're responsible for their emotional and mental safety too. So this can be creating things like individual risk assessments, looking at if someone has experience of trauma or similar experiences to your service users, making sure that's included in their risk assessment. If they have accessibility issues, having that in their risk assessment so that they can volunteer in the safest and best way for themselves. It's also about allowing them to have space so they know if there are issues, they can come to you. So we quite often hear the phrase safe space. We're actually moving more to use the term brave space, because there's no such thing as a safe space, because everyone enters a space with different experiences. But having the feeling like this is a place where they can speak out if they need to. Putting in steps to prevent re-traumatization. So we talked about that. So you might have a system where if it gets to when you're doing your safeguarding referrals, for example, they may do the disclosure form, but they might not necessarily be the person who's escalating and following up or doing any investigations. So that can then take away an extra level of anxiety and stress for them. That's just an example of what you can do. Having values-based questions in your interviews, I think, are really useful. So obviously we have safer recruitment things anyway. So we'll probably be asking values-based questions. So why do you want to volunteer? What brings you to this organisation in particular? I find in those conversations that's quite often when someone will share that they've got lived experience, and I'll just then, it's in my interview forms, just an additional question that is, if they have shared that they have lived experience, ask them how they would feel about supporting someone with similar experience, because quite often they might not necessarily think that that's a safe place for them. Quite often it's their inspiration for joining, so that's why they want to support. But asking them, giving them that choice. I've also found it's really helpful to ask if someone works in a field where they're a lot more likely to be hearing something quite traumatic, how they would feel about supporting a service user with similar issues. And I've absolutely made that mistake before, where I had a volunteer come to one of my mentoring organisations and share that they work with children and young people who are in mental health crises. So we were like, that's great for us. We've got a young person who really needs that support. And then that volunteer turned around to us and was like, this is what I do every day. I wanted to support a young person where I was out having fun and getting to see joy. And we just put her back into her really traumatic and stressful day job. So asking those questions can make sure you're putting the volunteer in the right place, but making sure you're not doing that re-traumatization, and that they're getting the volunteer experience that they wanted. And for this one, she just wanted some fun. So we were able to rematch her when she shared that with us, which was great. I've mentioned about following safeguarding best practice as well. There's also things you can do. Sorry, just about preventing re-traumatization. I really want to mention this because it's something that I think a lot of us were following advice about the phrase trigger warning. So in our training and in particularly in our training, when we're having conversations, a few years ago, the phrase trigger warning became very, very popular. And it's really important to do content warnings, but it's how you do them. So it's just saying the word trigger warning or content warning. They've discovered actually that increases people's anxiety because like, okay, I need to be ready now to be upset. And sometimes it's not necessarily an upsetting thing for that individual that you've shared, but you've kind of heightened their anxiety just by saying trigger warning. So when I start training, I'll always say, so we're going to be covering some difficult issues today. Make sure you look after yourself. We will give you a warning about what we're going to talk about. And when we get up to those stages, we'll say, we're going to be talking about this now. So please do. So rather than saying those slogans of trigger warning, content warning, just speak to them like humans and say, okay, we're going to be talking about this now. Please look after yourself the way you need to. Next up, trust and transparency. They need to be able to trust us, right? If they think that we don't know what we're doing or that we don't trust them, then you're going to be in a situation where it isn't a strong relationship. And the better relationship we have with our volunteers, the more likely they are to stay. And quite often, if you've got someone who's might have lived experience of the criminal justice system, they might have lived experience of oppression or lived experience of like the care sector, then they might feel that people don't put trust in them or that people have hidden information from them. So having that is going to be something that's possibly re-traumatizing. So yeah, just having clear policies and procedures, allowing them access to them. So it's not something that you just pop up in training, never mention again. They've got access to your policies and procedures as and when they need them. Having resource areas for them can be really, really useful. Explaining what you're doing at each stage of the way. We talk about this when we talk about safeguarding disclosures, about keeping the service user up to date with what's happening, informing them, but we need to inform our volunteers as well. And that can be just as simple as in your onboarding, making sure you're updating them every now and again. You could have, Lord knows, we've all waited ages for DBSs to come back or PVGs or a reference. Just popping them an email every 2 weeks to say, hey, sorry, just to give you an update, we're still waiting for your DBS. Just keeping them informed can be really important. It means that they're still engaged, you're not going to lose them as volunteers, but also kind of starts building that trust from the outset. Having clear instructions, not assuming that volunteers know what they're doing. So if you're face to face with volunteers, making sure that they understand their tasks, that they can come feedback what the issues are, and including them in decision making as well. So you've got buy-in at different points. Consistency as well was a big part of trust and transparency. So treating everyone the same way and not treating them differently from 1 week to the next. Next up is choice. I think this is so important in volunteering generally. But some people with lived experience might have had the power of choice taken away from them. If they've been in abusive relationships, they would have had the power of choice taken away from them. Quite often, if you've got younger volunteers or older volunteers, they are more vulnerable and therefore don't always get a choice in their lives and their decision making. So allow your volunteers to have choice. Build the volunteer journey around what they want. So listening to the needs of service users, staff and volunteers to understand all of our stakeholders. So we're not just making service user-based decisions, involving our volunteers in that too. They can have choice in their role, their development. So we would do PDPs, personal development plans, as staff. Why not introduce those to your volunteers? If you're doing a 6-month review with them, talking about how their first 6 months has gone, ask them what they want their next 6 months to be. Do they have new ideas they want to bring in? Because that can be really powerful. You might have a volunteer who is a social media master, but they're in doing, I don't know, befriending. And then like, actually, I've got this experience that I'd like to offer. So asking them if there's anything more they'd like to do. Obviously, we know flexible volunteering opportunities is really great for people who have accessibility needs or caring needs or anything like that. So trying to be flexible where we can. I know that is difficult because every single volunteer manager has been told, make your thing more flexible. And you're like, that's not how the program works. So trying to be flexible where you can and realistic where you can't. And also sometimes you might not be able to fit within your program. They might be able to offer another skill. I spoke about not having control over their relationships and their journey, so allowing them to have that in their volunteering experience. Collaboration is one of those charity sector buzzwords I mentioned. We love to say that we do lots of collaboration across the charity sector. We collaborate with service users. We are great at empowering youth voice, survivor voice, but making sure that we're also collaborating with volunteers. If we make unilateral decisions without consulting volunteers, you lose volunteers because they feel like they've lost the power, they've lost the trust, that they feel like you don't trust them to be able to make decisions about or offer input into what the volunteering journey should look like. So yeah, absolutely collaborate. And that can come in so many different ways. It might be about their particular role. It might be about offering peer support and guidance. One of the great things that we do in Grandmentors is we have mentor meetups online, and there's a member of staff there, but we don't talk. The volunteers come along to ask questions. And before we get an opportunity to answer, a volunteer who's been through something similar does. And that's really, really great because it gets to a lot of the time we talk to volunteers and you tell them, they're like, oh, yeah, okay. They don't necessarily believe or invest in what you're saying. It's like, well, you're a member of staff. If they've got another volunteer they can lean on and understand because they've been through something similar, it's something that's really magical. And you get to hear really nice sound bites as well when you're earwigging in those conversations in volunteer meetings. Obviously, doing our feedback surveys, our workshops. Currently, I'm doing a little bit of research into how to make surveys more inclusive, because actually surveys can be really jarring. So making sure that we're trying to do what we can to make sure they're inclusive and they don't feel like another bit of paperwork that's got to be done, and including them in workshops to build strategy. And of course, uplifting their voices. So it's our jobs to be the ones that's going into the trustee boards and ELT meetings and SLT meetings saying, this is what the volunteers have said. So we don't, again, just do volunteer surveys to go on a report somewhere and not actually provide action. Empowerment and voice. So sharing power. I don't like the phrase giving voice to the voiceless. Nobody is voiceless. Everyone has a voice. Some people have just had the power of voice taken away from them. So it's about empowering their voices and lifting them up and platforming those voices. So if you are going into a trustee meeting to talk about volunteering, bring volunteers with you. You can do some great, just get video content, voice notes, anything you can to have that first-hand experience of your volunteering. Also validating their feeling and concerns. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the big scale of strategy. Sometimes you might have a volunteer that's struggling. You say, come in, let's have a cup of tea. And if they're really struggling, validate and say, yeah, I understand that can be a difficult role. I understand this is a difficult situation. So validating their feelings and then asking them how they want to progress with the situation. They might not know at that time, and you might be able to work with them to create a plan, but asking them what they would like. Active listening is always lovely. I'm sure you've all been through active listening training and embedded in your training as well. We've talked already quite a bit about helping people feel they have control over their journey, and again, working alongside them to lift them up, not to be the voice box for them, but be the box that they get to stand on to shout their own voice. And then lastly, but definitely not leastly, cultural consideration. So we're all made up of different experiences and identities. Very few people belong to one culture or one experience. We are intersectional as human beings. We're all made up of every single thing that has contributed to our lives and every experience. So having policies and procedures in place that can respond to individual needs. So if you do have someone with accessibility needs or lived experience, when there's instances of microaggressions or discrimination, addressing those in place, addressing those there and then from a place of compassion. More often than not, if people are making the mistake of discrimination or microaggression, it might just be from a place of not understanding. So it can be a really great way to learn and grow together. Making sure that in those situations, you're dealing with it in the best way possible. So it might not be a case, if you've heard something, calling it out in front of everyone might actually be really upsetting, and quite upsetting for both the people who have been offended and the person who said it. So we have this idea of calling in. So talking to them on a human level might just maybe pulling them aside after, say, you mentioned this, I just wanted to check in and say that's not necessarily the language we would use, explain why it's a language, what language you would prefer to use and why. And then also making sure afterwards, if there were people of the group represented there that they've said something against, going in and checking them, seeing how they're feeling, because they don't necessarily want it to be called out in front of everyone, but checking in on their well-being is important and letting them understand that that's not something that you would tolerate or allow within the organisation. We do have some I do have some resources around calling in and calling out if you're interested. And of course, creating anti-oppression ways of working. It's not just enough now to say like we don't allow racism or we don't allow discrimination. We need to actively be working against it, because otherwise we're basically just being passive, and that's not acceptable anymore. We need to be making sure that we are actively combating against these things. And yeah, I've got some support around anti-oppression ways of working if you're interested. So that's the last of the 6 principles of trauma-informed practice. They are kind of endless in ways you might apply them. But I just want to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour around what they are, what they mean, and how you might think about starting to employ them. And now a little bit about that's a bright slide. If you weren't awake, that slide has just jolted your brain straight from listening to my waffle. So yeah, inclusive volunteering. So this is a new thing that I'm doing to try and support charities with the learning that I've got and things that I've been able to trial and implement within my own organisations. So as Mishka said, I've worked with the London Fire Brigade, National Domestic Abuse Helpline, the Kids Network, and now in Volunteering Matters. And I've delivered training like this in all those organisations, as well as a volunteer on a board for a youth charity. So, because that's what I do when I'm not working, I volunteer as a volunteer manager. Yeah, trying to apply the learnings that I've had there to then share with everybody else. So there's a consultancy arm. So if you want support in policies, procedures, or even creating volunteer strategy that's inclusive, that's something that we can support with. There's also toolkits. So although there is training available, and I can come in and train your staff, train your volunteers in volunteer management, as well as just trauma-informed practice when supporting service users, there are toolkits available as well. There's 3 at the minute. Where they're going to continue to grow. Plan is to get one out every couple of months. At the moment, we have an introduction to trauma-informed practice. But I basically just had it. And then there's one that's on onboarding, so how you recruit and onboard your volunteers in a trauma-informed and inclusive way. And then we have one on trauma-informed training, so making sure you're building training, delivering training that is trauma-informed and accessible. So those toolkits are there, so you can buy those rather than having a whole consultancy, because I want to make sure it's as accessible as possible. And then there's articles and blogs. So whenever there's new trends and things happening, I'm writing about it and sharing it. So there will be a newsletter that you can sign up to, or follow me on LinkedIn, because I'm always having a waffle on there and all. But yeah, those are the different things. And there is obviously cost attached to that. But if you are a smaller charity and you need support, come have a chat. Yeah, I'm so passionate about making sure that this is everywhere. So happy to have conversations about how we can support in a financially inclusive way. So there's a QR code, because what is a presentation without a QR code? If you want to sign up for more information, you can scan that. I've also got my email address there, or obviously Mushka, who is the oracle of all volunteer managers in the whole of the world, can always put you in touch. And that's the end. I'm going to drink my tea for a minute.
Oh, you deserve that tea. That was really, really good. And what a great taster into why we need trauma-informed practice in volunteer management. And I just want to know more. I've already signed up whilst you were talking to your newsletter on your website, because I was just like, I need to know more. So thank you so much, Maria. Really, really appreciate that. And that was really helpful. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to put your hand up or just unmute yourself. And after Maria's had her cup of tea, she'll be eager to answer, or just a couple sips, not a whole tea. Hi, Gabrielle. Oops, I can't hear you.
You can hear me now?
Yep, here we go.
My headset wasn't on properly. Rookie error. Thank you very much, Maria. I was struck when you were speaking about the principles, how relevant they are to inclusive volunteering in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, yeah, do you just think what's the core difference really between inclusive volunteering and the particularly trauma-informed practice? Are there any?
Oh, I don't think you can have one without the other, to be honest. I think that it's something that seems to be really missing from EDI strategy everywhere, that trauma-informed practice isn't part of it. Because if you are trauma-informed, you are inclusive. Because all those safeguards you're putting in to prevent re-traumatization and make sure everyone's treated as individuals, that's the same thing you should be doing for inclusion too. So yeah, I think that they go together so well. And if you're following the 6 principles, then you'll probably find you're creating quite an inclusive program generally. And that's why when I originally started doing this, I was labeling everything trauma informed. And I was like, well, actually, no, it's leading in so much more to just that. And it's just inclusion generally. So acknowledging things like disability and people from the queer community, you've got like people from different races and experiences and stuff. It's all the same thing. So yeah, I think they need to go hand in hand.
There you go. Ellie?
Hi there. Thanks very much. That was super interesting and what a lot to pack into 30 minutes. So great job, Maria. Fantastic. 2 things. I think at least one other person has asked if we would be able to get a copy of the slides. That would be fantastic if we were, just so that we can refer back to those principles among the other useful stuff that you've passed on. And my other question is, how would you suggest that we could use trauma-informed principles and approaches where problems arise with volunteers? So, for example, if we're looking at a volunteer's performance, or a volunteer who's potentially like not quite abiding by our code of conduct for volunteering, that kind of thing. So how would you suggest that we could approach those conversations in a trauma-informed way? I feel like that's something that's missing from a lot of the content I'm seeing on trauma-informed practice, and I'm really curious to learn more about that.
Yeah, great question. Actually, I've been working on this in my proper job. So I've been putting together kind of a conflict resolution plan, and I've actually labeled it volunteer re-engagement plan, because actually, if you're dealing with conflict with a volunteer, we're not about discipline. We're not, because we can't go through kind of performance management. But what we're trying to do is trying to work with the volunteer to find a way forward where both sides are happy, whether that's two volunteers, volunteer services, us as an organization and the volunteer. So I've kind of put together a bit of a process and a form as well, because I think actually having stuff written down for people to agree and work through is really useful. So it's a case of, what was the initial issue? Let's have a conversation with it. So meet the volunteer, get their side of how they came to that behavior, explain where you would come from and why you've got these policies, why you've got these procedures, and then kind of work together to create a bit of a plan to re-engage. So asking them, kind of knowing what you know now, you've done a bit more training, we've had that chat, how would you approach that situation going forward, and seeing if they would change their behavior. And I think, to be honest, we also need to be very clear in the volunteer sector that sometimes we do have to say thank you for your time, but I don't think we're fit for the organisation. And that if it's coming down to things like safeguarding, breaching code of conduct, but quite often it's just a case of, where did we get to here? How can we work better together? And what steps will we take? And that might be like, actually, I'd really like training in this specific thing. So it might not be training that you offer, but you might be able to say, okay, I'll look into that, come back to you. It might be that they want to change their role. It might be that they want to do less hours, have a break. I've also said that to volunteer, why don't you have a month off, and then we'll have a cup of tea, and when you come back, and then we'll see how we go from there. So I think having that plan in place of re-engagement and making it clear from the beginning that this isn't a disciplinary, this is about kind of figuring out how we can work together better to make your volunteer journey better for you and better for us. I hope that answered was a bit waffly.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot.
And feel free to drop me an email, Ellie, and I'll share you with you what I've got. It might not be exactly what you need, because obviously it's very much for mentoring, but I might be able to kind of give you a bit of inspiration for it.
That was really good. And I think what I'm picking up is language really matters. I love that you call it re-engaging the volunteers instead of conflict resolution. I think that is brilliant. Ali, do you have a question?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much. Firstly, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing, obviously, the details of the session and the information you've gone over. Your point earlier, Maria, about it being such a area of EDI that maybe isn't spoken about as much, especially in volunteering, is yeah, so it's great to see obviously more information around it. For a bit of context, yeah, so I work at LSE in the university's volunteer centre. And yeah, we exist to connect students to volunteering, and we support students in every area of volunteering. We're lucky enough to have fantastic uptake, but we have students, that are interested in supporting homeless people, refugee and asylum seeker support, mental health charities, a range of different charities, but some of them are potentially higher risk for perhaps coming, with maybe more sensitive issues or kind of emotionally kind of challenging spaces of volunteering. And I run a couple of programs, and it's always, of course, our complete intention to support students who might feel upset by anything that they encounter, or my usual signposting is to kind of refer back to the charity, who are usually kind of experts in the area that will probably have like the policy or the guidelines on lived experience, or just supporting their volunteers in general. But beyond that, are there any other like resources or ways that we could potentially approach that, just thinking of how we can best support the students who might encounter emotional kind of difficulties or sort of well-being challenges in that area? Because yeah, my usual practice is to kind of more or less refer back, but if there was anything else you could suggest, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, referring back is always great because it encourages the charity, to be fair, to be supporting that volunteer, because that's what they should be, and they are experts. But I think something that's really useful that I used to do on the helpline when I was delivering training was, at the end of every session, we started building a self-care toolkit. And so kind of getting people to think about, so what are you going to do after your volunteering shift? So I would always share, so if I was on a shift on the rescue abuse helpline, I would always watch an episode of Taskmaster, because I'm sure, Nade, you can absolutely, everything on TV, if you've just done a shift, is about domestic abuse. It's everywhere.
Yes, it is absolutely everywhere. Yeah, totally. And I think with the new government incentives and things as well, it's becoming more and more prevalent. Thank goodness.
Yeah, it's so, there's so much raising awareness, which is amazing, except if you're trying to switch off from that. So yeah, I would watch an episode of Taskmaster. I know people that would go for a walk with their dog, people that just went and did the washing up. So I'd say, okay, what are you going to do to prepare for your shift, and what are you going to do afterwards to clear your headspace? I find a really useful thing to do with volunteers and kind of everything is a self-care menu. So as part of the training, I say, okay, think about something that takes you 5 minutes to give you a brain break. It might be going to make a cup of tea. For me, I'll scroll TikTok for 5 minutes. So that's my 5-minute activity. Then I say, think of something that's going to take you 30 minutes so you can have a proper break. That might be walk or call a friend. And then think about something where you've got 3 hours. And they can add as many things to those 5, 10, 30-minute out, 3 hour long sessions. So, because sometimes when you're thinking, oh God, I'm so stressed, the idea of thinking about something to de-stress adds another layer of stress to it. So having like a mental health menu of, right, this is something that I know that makes me happy. I might do a bit of drawing. I might go to the bath, whatever it is. Like my old housemate used to iron. Not for me, but it's individual for everyone. So yeah, just kind of giving them tools like that so that they're able to support themselves, as well as absolutely you're doing the right thing if you're telling them to go and speak to their volunteer manager.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's great.
I love that, but I'm more impressed that you can spend only 5 minutes on TikTok.
Honestly, I have to.
That's impressive.
My really bad thing is I say, right, so at 12:30 I'm going to stop. When it gets to 31, I'm like, well, got to go to 35 now, and I am tired.
No, it's dangerous. Does anyone have any other questions? Claire said, I love the toolkit idea. It's so personalized. Michelle.
Hi, yes, I've got a question. And it's around a volunteer we had who was a survivor of domestic abuse. And we recently relaunched our safeguarding training. So we asked all of our volunteers and staff to complete an e-learning safeguarding module, which didn't go into a lot of detail, I have to be honest. It was quite light touch training. And she came back to me and said, "Oh, actually, I'm finding it quite triggering, so I'd rather not, thanks." Which left me in a bit of a difficult position. But I did then thought, okay, I'll give her some space because she wasn't actively volunteering at the time. And she has now left the organisation because she's had to give more hours to her job. So it's like the problem has gone away for me, but I just think, how could I have handled that to give her any support through it, in case something like that comes up again?
It can be different when it's difficult when it's kind of compliance training, it's something that's tracked. But usually I would say work through it with them. And if it gets to that bit, skip that bit and then find a way to have that conversation one to one. So I've absolutely had people walk out of safeguarding training before because something has come up that they've had personal experience or familial experience with. And that's absolutely fine. I will go and check on them and say, we still need to do that to make sure that you understand, but we can do that one on one. We can do it really slowly and try and just, do it in a more person-centered way, because sometimes those click-throughs can be really jarring sometimes. So if there is a way for you to do it one on one, you might want to do it kind of virtually like this, just both logged onto the screen, and then support where you can kind of click through those bits. You know the learning because you've done it God knows how many times. So then you can go through and say, these are the bits that are discussed, and these are what the actions. Because most of the time when those e-learnings, it's about raising awareness for issues that they don't necessarily understand, that are the bits that are the most upsetting. So they're not upset about this is how you write a referral form, this is how you ring your line manager. It tends to be about recognizing abuse, and you don't usually need to explain to survivors about how to recognize abuse. So, but you can go through those bits and say, these are the things you might want to listen out for when you're supporting a service user. So yeah, that's what I would do. I would allow them to have those breaks, but try and go through it one on one.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you.
That's really good. I have a question for myself. You mentioned in your presentation about surveys, volunteer surveys being more inclusive. Do you mind telling me a bit more? I don't want to get too much information out of you for free, so I don't know if I need to, I am conscious of your toolkits that you have on offer. In what way can we make surveys a bit more inclusive? Is it the questioning, how we send out the surveys?
Yeah, I think part of it is we do it once a year and we send them something that takes ages. And we say it's only going to take 10 minutes, but it doesn't take 10 minutes. And it's just can be really arduous. And if you're, for example, say if you've got a refugee experienced person, they will have done, or someone who's been through the care system, they will have done a thousand surveys, a thousand forms. And so some people can find forms really upsetting and really triggering because it's just another thing where they've got to put something through and they might not necessarily be asked. And there's situations where as well, like volunteers are busy. If you get the email, they might think, I'll do that, like, yeah, they've forgotten. So just part of the accessibility is understanding that our volunteers have lots of commitments. They might be carers and things like that. So I think a really interesting way, and I absolutely think Volunteero would be a great way to do this, is rather than doing one survey at the end of the year, let your survey take a year. Where, do you know, on LinkedIn, you get those little pop-up surveys where it's just one question? Have that where you're just sending in your group chat a question, where it's a poll, or it could be on Volunteero. You could send an email where all they've got to do is click one button and you can collect the same information, but over a longer period of time. So you're still going to get it at year end. You've just been collecting it throughout. And I think that also kind of creates open conversations. So like we use WhatsApp a lot in our organization. We've got like mentor groups where they chat to each other. If you popped a question on there, you'd also start a conversation. So not only would you get the data of them clicking the answer, but you'd also start a conversation where the volunteers are talking to each other and you can collect that data as well. So that's one of my ideas about how you can make it seem less like a process and more like just something that we do.
Well, I love that you mentioned that because that's what Volunteero is all about. So after each mission they do, so it could be a fundraising event, it could be a mentoring session, they will get a pop-up notification and you can customize the question. So how's the client feeling? And if it's anything below, if it's 1 to 5 and you put a 2, it will put an alert to the volunteer manager to check in on the volunteer and see, or how are they feeling. It will send them an alert to the volunteer manager to check in with the volunteers. So you're right, after each volunteer session, there should be little surveys, little reports coming in. But yeah, you're right about some of those surveys are so long. Just long, and it's just like, and it's not even relevant sometimes. Like sometimes you're going to have a micro volunteer getting that survey and being like, why do I need to do all that? I volunteer 3 times a year to this charity.
And the way kind of surveys systems are going now is it does it in like sections. So you'll scroll and you think, right, I'm nearly done. And then you get to the next section. You're like, oh, there's another 20 bits on this bit.
Yeah.
And then you've finished your tea break at work and then it's lost forever.
Yeah, no, Volunteers also launched their survey feature where after you can trigger survey. So if a volunteer exits, you trigger a volunteer exit survey. So they get a push notification to fill out a survey through that. It's all about push notification. I mean, I saw some surveys where it's like filling out a document on Word document and it's just like, yeah. Paula has asked how much it is for the group trainings. Paula, should I tell Paula, do you want to email Maria after this and
I was
inquire?
just wondering whether there was a ballpark figure,
Yeah.
to see whether there was an interest. Because I can see
So it's
the toolkits are £19 to £49. So I was just wondering, I couldn't find it on the site when I was looking.
So there's a few different trainings on there, but I can also create bespoke training if you want. So for example, if like you're in a DA organization, I've got experience in DA, so I can create bespoke stuff for that. But usually around 500 quid a session. And they're between they're usually around like 2.5 hours, 3 hours, depending. Some of them are longer, but they'll have the detail on the website. But yeah, around 500 is a ballpark.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Gabrielle, am I pronouncing your name correctly? I just want to double check.
Yeah, you are. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah. Sorry to hog the questions. Just when Maria was answering Michelle's question about supporting someone through training, and it kind of made me think, oh, is there a risk of putting yourself as a volunteer organizer manager in a position where someone's, I don't know, really upset or their mental health is impacted really severely, and like how I think through experience, I've learned to kind of recognize the limits of my expertise and call for help. But yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak a bit about looking after ourselves and managing that and not biting off more than we can chew, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. We aren't mental health specialists. We aren't counselors or social workers for our volunteers. So having those boundaries, so being able to escalate, you might have. I think for me, I think it's really important to advocate for our volunteers to really be part of the organisation. So if you have mental health champions, being able to defer to them. We've actually started getting a couple of our volunteers trained as mental health champions, so then they can offer peer support. Something else, like if you have an EAP, advocate for your volunteers having access to that, because if you're dealing with things like abuse and they're having to hear that and getting that vicarious trauma, they deserve your EAP too. So yeah, advocating that with senior managers. I think also having peer support. So something that we did in the helpline is we had on shift, there was a Zoom open. And if you had something difficult going on, you could pop into that Zoom and there'd be staff and volunteers on there and you could have support as and when you needed it. So you could get off a call or you could get off a web chat and you'd be able to ask for advice or support or just get some emotional support there as well. So I think building structures around having mental health support embedded in what you do and allowing and kind of signposting your volunteers really early on in their training and having that signposting available. So it might be a case of you want to sign off to a different organisation that offers mental health support. So yeah, I think making sure that they're aware of where the support is and building those supports in. But for you as a staff, making sure that you have support from your line manager and are able to kind of take those breaks. So like if I had a member of staff had to deal with a very, very difficult, complex safeguarding, and it was take the rest of the day off. I'm going to take this piece off of you and deal with that, because I don't think you're in a position, like, you're feeling safe enough to deal with that right now. So I dealt with it. Told her to take the rest of the day off because she had her kids in the house, and that's not appropriate for her to be stressed and dealing with safeguarding when she had her kids in the house. So I took it on, and the next day we had a chat, and she felt much better about it. So having those systems in place as well, where your manager is doing what they should be doing for your support, and being able to say, I hope that you all feel confident enough to say to your managers, I'm out of my depth here, I need help.
Thank you.
Oh, much for you're on the mute, but Fiona?
Sorry, Fiona.
Hi. I was just wondering, so we don't offer a service that means that we're expecting our volunteers to come into contact with traumatic situations and people and difficulties in that sense, but we do projects that involve participatory practice. And so I was wanting to go back to what you were talking about when you were saying quite often people were motivated by having a particular experience to give their time to your organization, but but they may not actually want to be actively involved. I feel like the emphasis with the participatory practice would be that is why they're involved, and actively we're seeking to engage with those experiences and engage with them because they have those experiences. And I wondered if you felt that that changed anything in the way you would approach your trauma-informed kind of working.
I don't know if it would change the way. I would definitely then want to make sure that my staff were aware what trauma-informed practice was and different parts of the onboarding systems that had that. So, so yeah, I have the toolkit and the training sessions that I do about onboarding and recruitment are about making sure that we're advertising in an inclusive way, that the application process is fair and accessible and not upsetting for those people who might, because our applications, we have to be very careful that we're not shutting ourselves off to people who have struggled with employment or struggled with disengagement from things like education and employment, because actually it might start to feel like a job, and then that's upsetting. So yeah, kind of making sure those processes are in place. And I think I have this thing, if you make it accessible for one, you make it accessible for all. So if you're doing that naturally, when you are getting into programs where you're auditing, particularly with people who are going to have accessibility issues or have faced exclusion before, or social exclusion, then you don't have to worry about it because you know you're already doing the right stuff.
Great, thank you. I wondered if there was anything particular that you think, but I kind of feel like as well that quite often we do that in a partnership model. So they usually have a community group that is offering additional support to them. So yeah.
I would say in that, if you're got a referrer, I always love chatting to my referrers to make sure I know everything about that service user as well, and to make so, or the volunteer, to say, if you've referred that volunteer to me, if you've referred that service user, let's have a chat if there's anything we can do to support. This summer I run a volunteer at summer camp, and whenever I get an application from a child who has additional need, I ring their caregiver and have a chat. And then like this year we had a kid who was when he gets like emotionally dysregulated, she's like, just talk to him about Pokemon. So before camp started, I went to the charity shop, bought a couple of books of Pokemon, and when he had a meltdown, he just went and read. And that was something that a little like nugget of help that I got from his mum. And that's really useful, being able to talk to your referrers and say, is there anything in particular I can do for this volunteer or this service user to make sure that I'm getting a bespoke thing for them, to make sure that if they are getting dysregulated, I know what to look out for and how to support.
That's great, thank you.
Well, I think we can wrap it up now. I am going to put Maria's details in again, and highly recommend giving her a follow on LinkedIn and checking out the website, sign up to the newsletter, contact her for any more information. Thank you so much, Maria. That was really, really interesting, really engaged. I mean, we had some really great questions as well. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Maria, for your time. And hope we can follow up a little bit more with this topic. So thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone.